AITA for my dad, making me sleep in a camper so my stepbrother could have a room? Ever since my dad remarried, I knew something in the family dynamic had broken, even though he presented it as a fresh start for everyone. I was 15, and though I wasn't a little kid anymore, I didn't feel strong enough to cope with the sudden changes. My mother had passed away a few years earlier, and although the wound was still fresh, my dad wasn't one to dwell on healing. He was the type to bury his pain with work, beer, and practical decisions. And one of those decisions was to bring his new wife and her son to live in our house. According to him, life had to go on and everyone deserves a second chance. But what no one seemed to ask was if I deserved one too. My father's new wife was a woman who, from day one, looked at me with that mix of pity and judgment you never forget, as if I were the uncomfortable reminder of a previous life she'd rather ignore. She arrived with her son, 3 years younger than me, a quiet but cunning boy who understood from the start that his mother would place him at the center of everything. The first week they were with us, my room remained mine. But it only took the boy mentioning that he'd never had a bed to himself for my dad to decide it was time for a temporary adjustment. He told me in a kind tone, as if he were doing me a favor. He said it was a short-term solution, that it would give me some independence, and even do me good. "You're almost an adult. Son, this can be your own space. Not every kid has their own place," he said, proudly pointing to the old camper that had been parked in the back of the yard for years, right next to the shed where we kept rusty tools and dried-up paint. The camper was nothing more than a tin can that smelled of confinement. My grandfather had used it decades ago for fishing trips, and it hadn't seen an upgrade since. The windows were sealed with old tape, the hinges creaked, and the mattress felt like a damp rug. But the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, but the feeling of being pushed out of your own home, as if you didn't fit in, as if you were no longer part of the family, but a bothersome tenant who should be grateful not to be evicted altogether. That night, I gathered my things without protest. I carried my pillow, a suitcase with clothes, and my guitar, the only one left after we sold several things after my mom's death. I remember, as I settled in, hearing the laughter from the living room. They were eating pizza, playing cards, and talking as if that place, which until recently was also mine, had always belonged to them. The first nights in the camper were a mix of cold, discomfort, and anger. The generator barely worked, so I lit the place with a flashlight. There was no heating, no air conditioning, no running water. If I had to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, I'd cross the freezing yard, slip in through the back door of the house, and pray that no one would see or say anything. Sometimes I found the door locked and had to urinate in a bottle. When I mentioned this to my father, he said it was my fault for not planning better, as if needing to use the bathroom during the night was my failure. He said it casually, without remorse, as if each time they pushed me a little further from the center of his life, they did it with logic and not cruelty. Over time, the camper became my reality. It wasn't an official punishment, but a form of exclusion disguised as independence. My stepmother made sure to remind me that sometimes you have to learn to adapt if you want to survive, while fluffing the new cushions in the room that used to be mine. At school, no one knew what I was going through, because the last thing I wanted was to be the kid who slept in a rusty camper in the backyard. I tried to keep my grades up, but everything started to fall apart. The stress took its toll. I had trouble concentrating, and by the end of the semester, I'd failed algebra and almost flunked another subject. I also lost my part-time job at the gas station because I was showing up with dark circles under my eyes, distracted, half asleep. It was at that point that I began to doubt everything. I doubted if I was really worth anything, if there was any point in continuing to fight when it seemed like no one noticed my efforts. I couldn't even talk to my father without feeling like everything that came out of his mouth was a polite way of telling me he was disappointed in me. But what hurt most wasn't his direct indifference, but the fact that he seemed to have completely replaced his old son with a new one. My stepbrother had my bed, my books, my guitar, and even started wearing some of my shirts without asking. When I tried to say something, my dad told me not to cause trouble, that I should be more understanding. "He's been through a lot too," he said, as if I hadn't been through anything. That was the day I felt the thread connecting me to that house was gone. One night, after a storm that rocked the camper and left me soaked from a leak in the roof, I grabbed my phone and texted my Uncle Mickey. He wasn't someone I talked to often, but he'd always been the only adult who truly treated me with respect. The message was short, more of a confession than a request. I told him I was living in a camper, that I didn't have a room anymore, that I felt like they were pushing me out of my father's life little by little. I didn't expect him to do anything. I just needed someone to know, someone who could tell me I wasn't crazy, that what I felt made sense, that I wasn't overreacting by feeling like I'd been replaced. I didn't know that night would mark the beginning of something completely different. Update 1. Exactly 13 days had passed since I wrote to my Uncle Mickey. The sound of an old engine pulling up to the back of the house came early one Saturday. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the grass was still covered with thick drops of dew. I was sitting on one of the small benches in the camper, trying to warm my hands with a cup of instant coffee I'd made with an immersion heater, the kind you plug directly into an outlet. It wasn't real coffee, but at least it kept me awake and gave me an excuse not to go into the house so early, where everyone seemed to live in a different universe than mine. When I heard the vehicle door close with that dull, metallic thud that only old doors make, I knew it wasn't a delivery driver or one of the neighbors. I peeked out the camper's side window, and there he was, in his denim jacket, his Yankees cap, and that expression I couldn't tell if it was concern or suppressed anger. I didn't have time to go out. He was already coming straight for the camper. When I opened the door, he just said, "Give me 15 minutes, and I'll leave it better than new." Without saying much more, he opened his toolbox, got under the camper, and started checking the generator as if it were his own son sleeping in there. I didn't know whether to feel relief, shame, or both at the same time. I just watched silently as he moved wires, cleaned parts with a ripped t-shirt he pulled from his back pocket, and muttered phrases under his breath like, "They left this messed up, and who lets a kid sleep like this?" After an hour and a half, when the sun was starting to warm the air and my father still hadn't bothered to come out or even look out the window, Mickey suggested we go to breakfast. He said there was no point in staying there all day on an empty stomach. We left in his rusty Ford that smelled of stale tobacco and engine grease. We stopped at a roadside diner, the kind that opens at 5 a.m. and serves weak coffee in thick porcelain mugs, as if they were relics from another era. I ordered pancakes with bacon, and he ordered the same. While we waited for the food, he looked at me with the calmness that only people who've been through a lot and are no longer surprised by anything possess. He told me to tell him everything from the beginning. I didn't need any urging. As soon as I finished the first sip of coffee, it all came pouring out. How they'd taken my room, how the camper leaked, how I couldn't concentrate in class, how I lost my job, how my father pretended everything was normal, how my stepmother said I should learn to be grateful for having a roof. I told him about the cold nights, the fear when the generator failed, the guitar her son now used without permission, and how, sometimes, I felt like I was becoming invisible inside my own home. Mickey didn't interrupt. He just listened. Sometimes he nodded, sometimes he frowned, but he never interrupted, not to say, "I'm sorry," not to minimize what I was saying. When I finished, he just sighed and said he didn't understand how my father could allow such a thing, that not even in his worst days with his own father had he experienced anything like it. He told me to stay calm, that he had already installed a temporary system so the generator could at least handle a portable air conditioning unit, and that he'd be back during the week to bring me one he had stored in his workshop. He also told me that if things continued like this, I should go live with him, that I didn't have to put up with it anymore. We went back to the house after breakfast. No one asked where I'd been or why I'd left so early, not even my father, who barely looked up from his newspaper when I walked into the yard. Mickey spent the whole afternoon fixing more things in the camper. He sealed the window with new insulation he brought from his workshop, installed a heavier-duty extension cord, and left me several LED bulbs so I wouldn't have to rely solely on the flashlight. When he finished, he wiped his hands on the old t-shirt, looked at me, and said, "For now, it'll do." He patted me on the shoulder and said goodbye as if he didn't want to. That night, when I moved my pillow to adjust it, I found a folded $100 bill inside a paper napkin. It didn't have a note, instructions, or justification. It was Mickey's way of telling me he knew I needed help, even if I didn't ask for it. I stared at that bill as if it were a relic from another life, one where there was still someone who considered me part of their family, without conditions or excuses. I couldn't sleep well that night, but it wasn't because of the heat or the noise of the bugs, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone saw me, not as a problem, not as a burden, but as a boy who simply needed a place to belong. Update 2. 6 months had passed since that morning when Mickey appeared like a life raft in the middle of the shipwreck that was my life. And although his intervention gave me a little breathing room, the situation at home only got worse. What at first seemed like an uncomfortable cohabitation gradually turned into a declaration of intent. That family didn't want me there. My stepmother took complete control of the spaces. She redecorated the living room, changed the curtains, painted the walls with pastel colors that looked like they were taken from a cheap magazine catalog, and then turned my old room into a sort of game room for her son. They put in a large screen TV, LED lights, a new game console, and even a gaming chair that, I overheard my dad say on a phone call, cost more than he paid for 2 weeks of groceries. The irony was that while he was splurging on that, he told me there was no budget to pay the camper's electricity bill, that the rate increase had us against the wall, as if I were a burden draining the family's resources. I had lost my part-time job at the gas station, not because of misbehavior, but because of accumulated absences. I wasn't sleeping well, I was arriving late, and I was walking around like a zombie. Although the manager was understanding, he couldn't justify keeping me there. With the little money I had left, I tried to save for community college tuition, but I couldn't even scrape together half. When I sat down to talk to my father to ask for help, he acted surprised, pretended he didn't know I was so short on money, that he thought the money I earned at the gas station was enough. Then, without the slightest shame, he told me that he preferred to save for his new son's college fund because he was younger and needed opportunities now. I just stared at him, not understanding how someone could say something so hurtful so calmly. I wanted to yell at him that I was his son too, that I also needed opportunities, that I also had the right to have a future. But I didn't say anything. I just got up and left. I didn't cry there. I waited until I got to the camper, closed the door, and let the silence swallow me whole. Winter came early that year, and with it came a cold that not even the thickest blanket could hold back. Mickey had brought me a small portable heater, but the camper's generator couldn't handle the extra load anymore. The lights flickered, the portable refrigerator malfunctioned, and more than once, I was left without power in the middle of the night. One of those nights, while I was trying to fall asleep wearing 2 pairs of pants, 3 pairs of socks, and a blanket pulled over my head, I felt a sharp headache and a strange pressure in my chest. I stumbled out of bed, opened the door as best I could, and collapsed onto the snow in the yard. The next thing I remember is the sound of my own ragged breathing, the ice melting under my face, and the lights on in the house. No one came out. No one asked if I was okay. At dawn, when I managed to drag myself to the back bathroom of the house, my stepmother crossed paths with me in the hallway and told me, with annoyance, that I should clean the rug because I left mud on the floor. She didn't even stop to ask if I was all right. That morning, I picked up my phone with trembling hands, dialed Mickey's number, and told him what had happened. I didn't ask for help. I just relayed the facts, like a reporter describing an accident. He didn't say much, just asked if I was sure about how I felt and if I wanted to get out of there once and for all. I said yes. He told me to pack what I needed and to wait for him that afternoon. He arrived after 5 p.m., his truck full of tools, and an empty plastic box for me to put my things in. He didn't bring sweet words or motivational speeches, just hugged me, helped me pack my things in silence, and took me to his apartment in Raleigh. The place wasn't big. It was a space above the workshop where he worked as a mechanic. It had a room with a twin bed, a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a window overlooking a noisy avenue. But it had heat, a hot shower, clean walls, and a table with 2 chairs where I could sit and eat without feeling like an intruder. He gave me the main room and moved to sleep on an old recliner he had next to the TV. He insisted it was temporary, that as soon as I was better we'd find another solution. He got me a job as a helper in the workshop, cleaning parts, moving boxes, and little by little, he taught me how to use tools, identify engine parts, change oil, and diagnose simple malfunctions. During the day, we worked together, and at night, he helped me review the forms to re-enroll in college. He lent me his old laptop, taught me how to use it, and made me apply for every local scholarship we could find. He made me promise I wouldn't let myself fall again, that he had me, that I wasn't alone anymore. I lived with him like that for almost a year. And although the wound of being displaced by my own father was still open, having someone treat me with dignity began to change me from the inside out. For the first time in a long time, I woke up without anxiety. I felt useful, valued. Mickey wasn't perfect. He had his temper and his silences, but he never made me feel like I had to earn his affection. He never looked at me as an obligation or a mistake. He treated me like a young man who needed a hand, not like someone who had to eternally pay for existing. The day I received the college acceptance letter, with a small partial scholarship and the possibility of studying at night while I worked, Mickey opened a beer and said, "See, there was no need for you to stay living like a dog in someone's backyard." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I just toasted with him, and that night I slept like I hadn't slept in years. Not because of physical exhaustion, but because, finally, I felt life was giving me a break. There was still a long way to go, but at least I wasn't alone on the road anymore. And, most importantly, I was starting to remember what it felt like to have a home, even if it wasn't the place where I was born or with the father who brought me into the world. Update 3. A little over 2 years had passed since that early morning when my body almost shut down from the cold in the camper. And now, looking back, I struggled to understand how I endured so long inside that rusty capsule without completely breaking. Living with Mickey had transformed not only my circumstances, but also my way of seeing the world, of seeing what I deserved and what I was no longer willing to tolerate. During the first few months, I focused solely on survival. I worked long hours in the workshop, studied at night, and barely ate enough to avoid fainting. Mickey taught me from scratch, like someone teaching how to ride a bike, but with tools instead of pedals. He showed me how to identify the sound of a failing spark plug, how to dismantle a transmission, and how to detect wear in a brake system just with a road test. And while he taught me about engines and parts, I was recovering parts of myself that I thought were dead. I started walking upright again, speaking with confidence, looking people in the eye. In the workshop, I earned the respect of the other mechanics, not because of my last name or favors, but because I worked harder than anyone. They gave me the dirtiest cars, the most damaged ones, the ones that required staying late, and I took them without complaint. I gradually gained clients, small orders, outside jobs that Mickey let me do on weekends to earn extra money. Every dollar I earned, I put into a savings account that I opened with the help of a college counselor, who also helped me apply for a scholarship for technical students. That scholarship, combined with my impeccable record, opened the door for me to transfer to State University and start the mechanical engineering program. It was something I never imagined possible when I was sleeping with 2 sweaters on and wet feet inside the camper. The day I received the acceptance notification, I cried alone, sitting on the bathroom floor of the apartment above the workshop. I didn't want to tell Mickey right away. I waited until the evening, after we had dinner of reheated bean tacos, and I handed him the letter as if I were giving him a trophy. He read it in silence, carefully folded it again, and told me, in a thick voice, almost hoarse with contained emotion, that this was just the beginning. "People like us can't afford to stay where they've been dumped," he said. "So now go and build something no one can take away from you." That summer, before starting classes, I worked as a research assistant with one of the college professors who recommended me for an electric vehicle project. It was a small, barely funded program, but with potential. I spent my days cleaning sensors, soldering wires, organizing parts that others discarded, and listening to everything the engineers said to each other, as if they were clues to a life that didn't yet fully belong to me. It was in one of those sessions that I first heard about a national competition sponsored by a luxury camper company that was looking to redesign the climate control system for its models. They were asking for innovative, sustainable proposals that would solve the problem of thermal inefficiency in extreme conditions. It was, without exaggeration, as if they had read my life story. For weeks, I worked on the design in secret. I would come back from the workshop at night, lock myself in the room, and use everything I had learned in college, in the workshop, and in life. I redrew more than 30 versions of the circuit before coming up with one that might work. A hybrid system of solar energy and secondary batteries, coupled with a microprocessor that would regulate the temperature based on the time, humidity, and user activity inside the camper. I didn't have the materials to build it, but I could submit the written project and the 3D blueprints. Mickey didn't quite understand what I was doing, but every time he saw me up late, with ink-stained hands, he just said he trusted I was about to build something big. In the fall, I received the call. I had won first place. Not only that, but the company wanted to buy the rights to the design to implement it in a pilot line of smart campers. And, in addition, they were offering me a paid 6-month internship at their headquarters in Charlotte. The prize included $5,000, a percentage of royalties for each unit sold, and the option to work on the innovation team. The call lasted 15 minutes, but when I hung up, I felt like I had just closed a chapter that had held me captive for years. The first thing I did was look for Mickey in the workshop. He was under a '96 Dodge, up to his elbows in grease. I told him everything while he wiped his hands, and, although he tried to maintain his composure, he couldn't help but laugh with that laugh of his that filled the space like thunder. A camper? You're telling me you slept in that rusty can? Now you're designing the ones that are worth a fortune, he said, hugging me tightly. That night, there was no fancy dinner or expensive celebration, just a box of cheap pepperoni pizza and 2 lukewarm beers. It was the most satisfying meal I'd had in years. However, that same night, while checking the emails I received after the official announcement of the contest results, I saw a notification that puzzled me. It was a message from my father. It wasn't long or emotional, just, "Your stepbrother is having trouble at school. I thought you could come over for a few days to talk to him. You're a role model now." I stared at that line as if it were a cruel joke. After years without a word, now that I was starting to have something of my own, he wanted me to come back, to help him, as if everything that had happened before hadn't happened, as if I hadn't slept amidst leaks, as if he hadn't pushed me out of his life to make room for another. I didn't reply. I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Anger, sadness, and that bitter mix of dignity and pain churned in my chest. It wasn't just the message, it was what it implied. The brazen way those who exclude you reappear just when they no longer need you, but when it suits them. And that was the first time I felt something in me wanted justice. Not with shouts, not with insults, but with actions, with the same ones they pretended not to see when they were breaking me. Update 4. A year and a half after that night when I decided not to respond to my father's message, my life had taken such a complete turn that sometimes I had trouble believing I was the same person who once slept with soaked socks inside a rusty camper. The internship with the luxury camper company had not only materialized, but thanks to my performance and the results obtained in the prototype tests, it turned into a full-time job offer as an engineer in the design and innovation department. It was a position that not only came with a salary I never imagined seeing in my bank account, but also allowed me to continue developing more efficient versions of the climate control system I had created, with access to tools, software, human resources, and resources that I had previously only seen in specialized magazines. I decided not to spend the advance on royalties impulsively. I knew very well what it was like to live without anything, and I wasn't about to become one of those young people who lose their heads with the first big check. I opened an investment account, hired a trusted financial advisor, someone recommended by a colleague from work, and with his guidance, bought a small duplex in a quiet area of Raleigh. Nothing ostentatious, but well located, with enough space to have Mickey on the ground floor, as I insisted that he deserved his independence too. I offered him that part of the duplex as a thank you, with no fine print or conditions. It was his from day one. He accepted, although it was hard for him. He said he preferred to pay me rent, that he didn't want charity. I replied that it wasn't charity, it was justice. He didn't insist further. He just said he was proud, that he saw me stronger than ever, and that he didn't need to sign anything because his word would always be worth more than a contract. Over time, Mickey's son, my cousin Nate, finished high school and became interested in mechanics. I invited him to the workshop, enrolled him in a technical course that I paid for with the royalty money, and saw in him something that moved me. A young man who, like me, hadn't had it easy, but who still believed he could build something better. I knew that if I had succeeded, I had a moral debt to anyone who was in the same position I had been in. It wasn't philanthropy, it was consequence. It was in the midst of this process, when everything seemed to finally be on track, that I heard from my father again. This time it wasn't by message or by call. It was through a legal notice that arrived at the workshop. The sender was the bank. I took the time to read it carefully, to verify names, addresses, account numbers. The notice announced the start of foreclosure proceedings on the house where he lived. My old house. The same one they had displaced me from with a smile on their faces and sweet words that, in reality, were a disguised form of abandonment. The document included details, months of accumulated debt, unpaid fees, negative reports. I cross-checked data and confirmed that my father had been unable to keep up with the payments for over a year and that, in addition, the land where the house was located also had municipal tax debts. All of this made me feel a mix of emotions that was difficult to process. It wasn't satisfaction, it wasn't sadness, it was a kind of raw justice, unadorned, like when life returns the cards that others threw on the table, believing you'd never have a chance to play again. I spent days deciding whether or not to intervene. I talked to Mickey, who was clear from the beginning. Do what you need to do, but don't let guilt or hate move you. Do it because you choose to, not because they ask for it. Those words followed me for weeks until one day, after reviewing every line of the mortgage debt and consulting with my lawyer, I decided to make the purchase. Not for them, but for me, because I couldn't forget what they had done to me, but I also couldn't let them destroy the only thing that had been taken from me without a fight. I bought the property through an intermediary to avoid suspicion, paid off the entire mortgage debt in a single transaction, had my name listed as the sole owner, and made sure to legally register that the use of the property would be subject to an annual lease with no option for renewal. When everything was finalized, I prepared a folder with the documents and took it personally. I didn't announce my visit. I arrived on a regular day, shortly before dusk, driving a brand new camper, one of the flagship models from the company where I now worked, with my name as part of the design team on the side panel. As I parked in front of the house, I noticed that the paint was peeling, the windows had old curtains, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I knocked on the door with the same hand that once held suitcases in the rain, while waiting for someone to remember that I was also part of the family. My stepmother opened the door. It took her several seconds to recognize me. Behind her, what used to be my room now looked like a messy, almost abandoned space. My stepbrother appeared wearing a ripped shirt, his hair disheveled, and his eyes downcast. He didn't look like the arrogant boy who once entered my life with the confidence of someone who believes everything belongs to him. Finally, my father came down the stairs. He was thin, aged, with the tired face of someone who can no longer pretend to be in control. They offered to let me in. I refused. I said I hadn't come for dinner. I hadn't come to relive the past or to assign blame. I just came to deliver a folder. Inside the folder were all the documents, the deed in my name, the lease agreement, the terms of the monthly payment, and the clear clause that if they defaulted, they would have to vacate the property. I asked them to read it carefully and, if they wanted to discuss terms, to do so with their own lawyer. I didn't yell. I didn't remind them of everything they had done. It wasn't necessary. Their faces said it all. My father tried to stammer something about family, about hard times, about difficult decisions. I didn't stop him. I just said that everyone had to take responsibility for the consequences of what they decide when they think someone is disposable. I left without waiting for an answer. As I got into the camper, I saw in the rearview mirror my father holding the papers with trembling hands, while my stepmother didn't look up from the ground. My stepbrother stood there, not knowing what to do. For the first time, they all seemed to understand what I had felt for so long. That unbearable coldness that doesn't come from the weather, but from the silence of those who ignore you when you most need to be seen. Update 5. 3 months after delivering the folder with the house papers and the lease agreement, I received an email notification that the first rent payment had been processed. It was on time, with no errors or delays, something that surprised me more than I expected. I checked the sender twice, as if there were a possibility that someone else was paying for them, but no. It was my father and his wife's joint account. They did it without calling, without writing, without offering apologies or explanations. I assumed they understood, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that this was the only option they had left. I hadn't given them a chance to negotiate because there was nothing to negotiate. It wasn't impulsive revenge or emotional punishment. It was simply the natural consequence of all their decisions. Over time, I started receiving indirect signs of how they were handling their new reality. My stepmother, according to a former workshop employee who also worked at a local supermarket, had gotten a job as a cashier's assistant. The woman told me she barely recognized her, but the attitude wasn't the same haughty one as before. She spoke softly, avoided eye contact with customers, and seemed to be constantly holding herself back from exploding. On the other hand, her son, The boy who once took over my room and my guitar without blinking had to enroll in the same community college I attended. I found out because one of the professors, with whom I still kept in touch because of the old projects, wrote to me to say he was surprised to find my last name on the enrollment list of one of his new students. I explained that he wasn't a direct relative and simply said that the twists and turns of life sometimes put people where they belong, sooner or later. What struck me most was learning that my father had gone back to work, not in an office or as a warehouse supervisor, like he used to. I saw him one Monday morning, standing by the gate of the workshop where I started my first job. He arrived by bicycle, with a backpack slung over his shoulder, visibly thinner, and wearing the same denim jacket he had worn for years. I watched him from the office window as he spoke to Mickey, who now ran the workshop independently while I worked at the company. I didn't approach him. I just observed him. There were no hugs or warm greetings. Mickey handed him some keys, indicated something by pointing to a delivery truck, and my father nodded without saying much. I assumed that Mickey, with his infinite capacity to separate compassion from human foolishness, had decided to give him a chance as a driver for auto parts deliveries. At the end of the day, he confirmed what I already suspected. My father had asked him for work without even mentioning my name, and Mickey had accepted, with the same dry tone with which doors are opened to someone who is desperate but still has to earn every penny. I didn't object. In fact, it seemed right to me that he worked, that he earned his rent, that every morning he got up early to move engine parts, clean grease, and deal with the heat of the workshop, like I did in my time, without anyone lending me a hand. It seemed fair to me that he knew firsthand what it meant to struggle for something from the bottom up, not so that he would suffer, but so that he would understand. Because the problem was never that he demanded I be strong, but that he was never willing to accompany me in the process. Now it was his turn to walk that same path, not by imposition, but because he had no alternative. During the following months, I saw him several times from the office. He always kept his distance. He arrived, did his job, received his assignments, signed the logs, and left. He didn't seek conversation or try to force any kind of reunion, and neither did I. I didn't ignore him out of hate. I ignored him out of respect, because there are wounds that you don't want to reopen, not because they still hurt, but because they have become scars that you choose not to touch again. Mickey, for his part, seemed to understand the tacit balance between us. He never forced him to approach me or asked me to forgive him. He only said once, in a hoarse voice, while we were sharing coffee in the backyard of the duplex, that sometimes the best revenge isn't taken by shouting or slamming doors, but by living well, with your head held high, and letting others drown alone in the consequences of their actions. As the weeks went by, I began to notice that my father sometimes stopped in front of the display camper I had designed and that we had parked next to the workshop. He observed it carefully, touched the side panel with the palm of his hand, as if trying to understand how the same object they used to push me away from the house had now become the symbol of my independence. He never said it, but his face had that mix of amazement and defeat that only appears when someone faces a truth they cannot change. One afternoon, as I was finishing organizing some folders, he entered the workshop, stopped at the entrance to my office, and asked me, in a low voice, if that was one of the models I had helped design. I replied that it was. He said it looked solid, efficient, nothing like the clunker I, well, you know. I didn't laugh, I didn't nod, I just looked at him. He looked away, stood there for a few seconds, and then said he wanted to know how I'd done it, not in an arrogant tone, but with a sincerity that took me by surprise. I answered with what I had learned since I hit rock bottom. That necessity teaches you quickly that when no one saves you, you have to learn to swim even if you don't know how, and that sometimes an uncle with grease-stained hand can give you more emotional stability than a father with all the right words, but no real action. There was no argument, no reproach. He just remained silent, nodded once, and left. I didn't know if he expected anything more, but I had no intention of giving it to him. What I had now wasn't anger, it was clarity. And clarity, sometimes, is the greatest punishment for those who failed you believing they would always have the power to return whenever they wanted. Every Friday, I check the status of the rent payments. Every week, I sign the check that authorizes his payroll. And every time I see him park the truck in front of the workshop, head down and shoulders slumped, I remember a time when I would have given anything for him to look at me with respect. Now I don't need it because it was enough for the world to put him exactly where he put me when he decided to close the door. And that, without needing to raise my voice, is the only justice I needed. Final update. A year after my father started working as a driver in the same workshop where I spent my toughest days, my life was at a point I never imagined reaching. The company I worked for not only adopted my climate control system as standard in its new camper lines, but also proposed that I lead an experimental division focused on sustainability and modular design. A dream that, for any engineer, represented the kind of opportunity that defines the rest of a career. My team grew, I was given creative freedom, and for the first time, I had a voice in production, strategy, and management decisions. I signed contracts with international suppliers, traveled across different states to study climatic conditions and adapt my prototypes, and even participated as a guest speaker at a national sustainable mobility convention. At one of these conferences, while explaining the importance of designing solutions for people in vulnerable situations, I mentioned, without naming names, the experience that had pushed me to find the original solution. Talking about that damp camper, the freezing nights, the silence you feel when no one opens the door for you, was as difficult as it was necessary, because I understood that the worst conditions don't just destroy, they also awaken. While all this was happening, the dynamic with my father didn't change much. His salary was modest, and although Mickey sometimes offered him longer shifts, he always limited himself to accepting just enough, as if he knew that any excess would be a form of emotional begging that he wasn't willing to engage in. The relationship with my stepmother and stepbrother was non-existent. I saw them from afar when I went to inspect the property to make sure everything was in order. They kept the house clean, paid their rent without delay, and didn't make any noise. They lived with an almost military discipline, as if every square inch of the place they once denied me had become fragile under their feet. Once, while supervising some roof repairs I ordered before winter, I saw my stepmother sitting on the porch with a notebook and a steaming mug of something in her hands. She didn't greet me, and neither did I. There was only a brief glance, the kind of glance that doesn't ask for anything, that only accepts. And, in a way, that was more powerful than any attempt at forced reconciliation. During that time, many people, colleagues, co-workers, even Mickey in his more reflective moments, asked me if I ever planned to forgive them, if I kept any corner of my soul open for a possible reconstruction. I always answered the same thing. What they destroyed wasn't just a room or a family routine, but a trust that, once broken, doesn't return with hugs or promises. I didn't need hate to stay strong. Memory was enough. Because remembering, without resentment, is the most elegant way to avoid repeating history. Months later, on one of those afternoons when work slows down and the sun begins to set leisurely, I sat in the camper that we had left as a permanent display at the entrance to the workshop. It had air conditioning, solar panels, smart curtains, and a state-of-the-art thermal insulation system. It was, for anyone, a luxurious space, but for me, it remained a reminder of everything I was forced to endure and everything I was able to turn into opportunity. While I was there, I heard someone approaching. It was no surprise to see my father standing a few steps away, looking at the camper with that expression of his that always oscillated between curiosity and resignation. He didn't ask to come in. He just said that from time to time he wondered what would have happened if he had done things differently. He said he didn't expect me to forgive him or to look at him as a father again, but that he wanted to say, at least once, that he was sorry, that he never knew how to handle my mother's death, that he let himself be guided by someone who promised him a new beginning without thinking about the cost, that he thought I would be strong, that I didn't need so much, that I would understand in time. I didn't answer immediately. I watched him in silence. His face was lined with wrinkles he didn't have before, and his eyes, although trying to remain steady, carried a weight that only years and guilt can bring. I told him that I no longer needed an apology, because what I had built without his help, and that was enough. That he also had the right to carry the burden of what he chose, but that now the rules were different. He worked for the company I helped build. He lived in a house that now belonged to me. Everything he once thought he controlled, he now had by contract, and he kept it not because I gave it to him, but because, just as I learned to live without him, now he had to learn to live under the conditions dictated by someone who should never have been treated as disposable. He stood still. There were no tears or pleas, just a long silence, as if every word had been suspended between us. Then he turned around and went back to the workshop. I stayed there, in the camper, looking out the window at the sunset. And, for the first time, I understood that my story wasn't a tragedy, but a statement, proof that you can be born into a family that doesn't know how to love you and still build a life that reflects the opposite. That night, I went back home, to the duplex I shared with Nate. He was in the kitchen, cleaning tools and listening to old music on the radio. He asked me if I had talked to the old man. I told him yes, that it hadn't been a big deal. He looked at me, nodded, and without taking his eyes off the rag he was using to dry a wrench, he said, "The important thing is that you're not sleeping in a camper anymore. Now you build them." And that says it all, don't you think? Yes, it said it all. Because, in the end, it wasn't about getting revenge so that the past would hurt less. It was about showing that what others use to crush you can become, if you know how to use it, the foundation of something that lifts you higher than any roof that was ever denied you. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.